The morning sun reflected off the gleaming hover cars at Star Drive Motors, Seoul's most prestigious vehicle dealership. Mr. Han stood at his office window, watching his staff prepare for another busy day. His thin fingers adjusted his perfectly straight tie as he observed the showroom below. At 52 years old, Mr. Han had spent 30 years selling cars and the last 5 years managing this dealership. He took great pride in running the cleanest, most organized showroom in all of South Korea. Every vehicle gleamed under the bright lights, positioned at exactly 45-degree angles to show their best features. "Mr. Han, the morning reports are ready," Ms. Kim said from the doorway. She held her datapad carefully, just as he had taught her. No fingerprints, no smudges. "Thank you." He nodded without turning around. "Are all the vehicles in perfect position?" "Yes, sir." Secretary Park finished the morning inspection. All hover cars are exactly 45 degrees, and the anti-gravity stabilizers are set to maintenance mode. Mr. Han allowed himself a small smile. This was why Star Drive Motors was the best. Attention to detail, proper procedures, perfect organization. The first customers began arriving as the giant quantum blast doors slid open. Mr. Han watched them enter, mostly wealthy business people and government officials. They moved carefully around the vehicles, maintaining proper distance, showing appropriate respect for the magnificent machines. Then everything changed. The doors opened again, and Mr. Han's eyes widened. A massive figure had to duck to enter the showroom. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that barely fit through the doorway. Its skin was covered in metallic blue scales that shimmered under the showroom lights. "What is that?" Mr. Han whispered, pressing closer to the window. "Sir," Ms. Kim quickly consulted her datapad. "According to the security scan, he's a Centaurian. Their species joined the Galactic Alliance 50 years ago." Mr. Han watched as the alien moved through his perfectly organized showroom. The creature's massive tail swayed dangerously close to a brand new Modulx hover car. Other customers pressed themselves against the walls, staring with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Has he made an appointment?" Mr. Han asked, his voice tight with concern. "No, sir, but the scanner shows he has diplomatic credentials." The alien stopped at the newest Modulx, the dealership's crown jewel. It was their most expensive vehicle, featuring advanced quantum propulsion and neural interface controls. The creature leaned close to the hover car, its scaled face nearly touching the pristine quantum glass windshield. Mr. Han felt his blood pressure rising. Did he just breathe on the quantum glass? "I believe so, sir," Ms. Kim replied carefully. She could hear the strain in her boss's voice. "Should I go down and assist him?" Before she could move, the alien reached out one massive hand and placed it directly on the windshield. The perfect, spotless quantum glass was now marked with a clear handprint. "That's it." Mr. Han straightened his jacket and moved toward the door. "No one touches the display models. No one." "Sir, maybe we should check his credentials first." Ms. Kim hurried after him, her datapad clutched tightly. "The security scan shows he's an important." "I don't care if he's the Emperor of Mars," Mr. Han said as he marched down the stairs. "There are proper procedures. There are rules." The alien had moved to the vehicle's interior now, somehow squeezing his massive frame through the driver's door. The hover car's suspension groaned under his weight. "Excuse me," Mr. Han called out as he approached. He used his best manager voice, firm but professional. "Sir, we request that customers do not enter display models without a sales associate present." The blue-scaled creature turned its head, yellow eyes blinking slowly. "Oh, hello." His voice was surprisingly cheerful. "This is a fascinating vehicle. The quantum core seems much more advanced than last year's model. Please exit the vehicle, sir." Mr. Han's tone grew firmer. "Just a moment," the alien said, his massive hand moving across the neural interface panel. "I want to check the response time of the..." The hover car's anti-gravity system suddenly activated. The vehicle rose 6 inches off its display platform, causing several nearby customers to gasp. The movement disrupted the perfect 45-degree angle that Secretary Park had spent an hour achieving that morning. "Sir," Mr. Hand's voice echoed through the showroom. "Exit the vehicle immediately." The alien looked surprised, but also slightly amused. "My apologies. Your gravity systems are very sensitive. On my world, we need to use much more force to..." "Out." Mr. Hand's professional demeanor cracked. "Now." The creature carefully extracted himself from the hover car, standing to his full height. He towered over Mr. Hand, but the manager didn't back down. 30 years of maintaining proper showroom etiquette had prepared him for this moment. "I am Ambassador Shaq," the alien said, extending one massive hand in greeting. "I was hoping to..." "I don't care who you are," Mr. Hand interrupted. "You have violated at least 6 showroom protocols. You touched the quantum blast. You entered a display model without permission. You activated vehicle systems without authorization. This is completely unacceptable." Behind him, Ms. Kim was frantically trying to get his attention. Her datapad displayed something urgent about the visitor's credentials, but Mr. Han was too focused on his mission. "In this dealership, we maintain standards," he continued, his voice rising. "We have procedures. We have rules. And they apply to everyone, regardless of their species or size." Ambassador Shaq tilted his head, studying the small human who dared to scold him. Around them, the showroom had gone completely silent. Other customers watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as Mr. Han, barely reaching the alien's chest, continued his lecture about proper dealership etiquette. Secretary Park, a young man in his first year at the dealership, slowly sank behind his desk. He was certain they were about to witness an interstellar incident, but Mr. Han wasn't finished. "Now," the manager said, pointing toward the door, "I must ask you to leave. When you're ready to respect our procedures, you may return with an appointment." Ms. Kim closed her eyes in despair. The datapad in her hands displayed the alien's full credentials, including one very important detail about StarDrive Motors' ownership structure. But it was too late. The morning sun still shone brightly through the quantum blast windows, reflecting off the perfect vehicles and the blue scales of their most important visitor. And Mr. Han, defender of dealership protocol, stood firm in his conviction that rules were rules, even in an age of interstellar commerce. The real question was, how long would it take for him to realize exactly who he was kicking out of his showroom? Ambassador Shaq stood near the doorway, his massive frame blocking the morning sunlight. He hadn't moved toward the exit as Mr. Han had demanded. Instead, he watched the manager with what seemed like growing interest. "Your dedication to rules is admirable," the alien said, his yellow eyes gleaming. "But perhaps we could discuss this more calmly." Mr. Han crossed his arms. Behind him, Ms. Kim was practically jumping up and down, trying to show him something on her datapad. But years of dealing with difficult customers had taught him to stand his ground. "There is nothing to discuss," Mr. Han replied. "You have disrupted my showroom. The Modulx's position is now 3 degrees off alignment. There are scale marks on the quantum blast. These are serious violations." Secretary Park, still hiding behind his desk, watched in amazement as his boss continued to scold the giant alien. Other customers had pressed themselves against the walls, their own shopping forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. "Mr. Han," Ms. Kim finally managed to say, "please look at this information. It's very important that you..." "Not now," Mr. Han waved her away. "Can't you see I'm handling a situation?" Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled, creating a wave of metallic blue that caught the showroom lights. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in my culture, such strong dedication to principles is highly valued. Though perhaps your method of expressing it is a bit direct." "In this dealership," Mr. Han continued, pointing at the handprint on the quantum blast, "we maintain the highest standards in all of Korea. Every vehicle is perfectly positioned. Every surface is spotless. Every customer follows proper procedures. The alien moved closer to the Modellux, causing Mr. Han to step forward protectively. "Don't touch it again," the manager warned. "I've already asked you to leave." Ms. Kim looked like she might faint. She turned to Secretary Park and whispered urgently, "Call Mr. Lee. Call him right now." Park nodded and quickly pressed his communication device. Their regional director needed to know about this situation before it got even more out of hand. Meanwhile, Ambassador Shaq had reached into his shimmering diplomatic robes. "Perhaps this would help explain my interest in your vehicles." He pulled out a small device that projected a holographic display. But before he could activate it, Mr. Han stepped forward and pushed the device away. "No unauthorized demonstrations in the showroom. That's another violation." The alien's yellow eyes widened slightly. Around them, several customers gasped. No one had ever seen anyone physically confront a Centaurian diplomat before. "Mr. Han." Ms. Kim tried one more time, her voice shaking. "He's not just any customer. He is someone who doesn't respect our procedures," Mr. Han interrupted. "And now he's attempting to use unauthorized technology in my showroom." Ambassador Shaq tilted his massive head. "Your showroom?" "Yes, my showroom. I have managed this dealership for 5 years. I have maintained its standards. I have ensured its reputation, and I will not allow anyone, human or alien, to disrupt that." The morning had grown warmer, and small beads of sweat appeared on Mr. Han's forehead. But he didn't back down. Even when Ambassador Shaq's tail swayed dangerously close to another display vehicle, the manager held his ground. "You show remarkable courage," the alien observed. "Most humans become quite nervous around my species." "I don't care what species you are," Mr. Han replied. "Rules are rules." Just then, the quantum glass doors slid open again. Mr. Lee, the regional director of Star Drive Motors, rushed in. His normally perfect hair was messy, and his tie was slightly crooked, signs that he had hurried to the dealership as soon as he received Secretary Park's call. "Ambassador Shaq," Mr. Lee called out, bowing deeply. "Please accept our most sincere apologies for any misunderstanding." Mr. Han turned to look at his boss, confusion crossing his face for the first time that morning. Why was Mr. Lee bowing so low to someone who had violated showroom protocol? "Mr. Han," Mr. Lee said quickly, "step away from the ambassador. You don't understand who he is." "I understand perfectly," Mr. Han replied. "He is someone who doesn't follow proper procedures." He touched the quantum glass. He activated systems without permission. He owns this dealership." Mr. Lee's voice cracked with panic. "He owns all of Star Drive Motors." The showroom fell completely silent. Even the gentle hum of the hovercar's anti-gravity stabilizers seemed to pause. Mr. Han stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the information slowly sank in. Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled again, this time in what appeared to be amusement. "Actually," he said calmly, "I own 60% of Star Drive Corporation worldwide. Your dealership is just one of many under our investment portfolio." Mr. Han felt the room spin slightly. He looked at Ms. Kim, who held up her datapad with trembling hands. There it was, the information she had been trying to show him all morning. The ownership documents, the investment records, everything. But Mr. Han's voice was barely a whisper. "But you touched the quantum glass." "Yes," Ambassador Shaq agreed. "I did, and you were absolutely right to call me out on it. That's exactly the kind of dedication to quality that made me invest in human businesses in the first place." Mr. Lee was still bowing, his face red with embarrassment. Secretary Park had emerged from behind his desk, but looked ready to dive back at any moment. And Miss Kim finally allowed herself to breathe normally for the first time since the blue-scaled alien had entered their showroom. Mr. Han straightened his tie, a gesture that had become automatic over his 30 years in the business. His mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. Had he really just tried to kick out the owner of the entire company? But before he could speak, before he could apologize or try to explain his actions, Ambassador Shaq did something unexpected. He laughed. The sound echoed through the showroom like rolling thunder, causing the quantum glass windows to vibrate slightly. "Mr. Han," the alien said, placing one massive hand on the manager's shoulder, "I think you and I need to have a long conversation about the future of StarDrive Motors." But first, he looked at the handprint he had left on the Modulx's windshield. "Perhaps we should clean that quantum glass." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through StarDrive Motors' quantum glass windows. Mr. Han sat in his office, staring at the datapad Ms. Kim had finally managed to show him. The ownership documents were clear. Ambassador Shaq wasn't just any customer. He controlled most of StarDrive Corporation's global operations. "I should prepare my resignation letter," Mr. Han said quietly. Ms. Kim shook her head. "Sir," the ambassador didn't seem angry. In fact, he looked rather impressed. Down in the showroom, Ambassador Shaq was examining the newly cleaned Modulx with Mr. Lee hovering nervously beside him. The regional director kept bowing and apologizing, but the massive alien barely seemed to notice. Secretary Park knocked gently on the office door. "Mr. Han, Ambassador Shaq would like to speak with you in the customer lounge." Mr. Han stood up slowly, straightening his tie one last time. If this was to be his last day at StarDrive Motors, he would face it with dignity. 30 years of selling cars had taught him how to handle difficult situations with grace. The customer lounge was the dealership's pride and joy. With its traditional Korean design mixed with modern comfort, it represented everything Mr. Han believed in. Respect for tradition while embracing the future. Now, it seemed barely large enough to contain Ambassador Shaq's massive frame. "Mr. Han," the alien greeted him warmly. "Please, sit down. Mr. Lee, Ms. Kim, Secretary Park, you should join us too." They arranged themselves around the low table. Mr. Lee kept glancing nervously between Mr. Han and the ambassador, clearly expecting some kind of explosion. But Ambassador Shaq simply poured tea for everyone, his huge hands somehow managing the delicate cups with surprising grace. First, Ambassador Shaq began, "I must apologize for not introducing myself properly this morning. On my world, we have a tradition of testing businesses we invest in. We like to see how they operate when they don't know who we are." Mr. Han stared into his teacup. "I am the one who should apologize, Ambassador. My behavior was inexcusable." Inexcusable. The alien's scales rippled with amusement. "Mr. Han, do you know why I chose to invest in StarDrive Motors 5 years ago?" "No, Ambassador. Because this company values excellence. It maintains standards. It follows procedures." Ambassador Shaq's yellow eyes fixed on Mr. Han. "Sound familiar?" Mr. Han looked up, confused. Those were almost exactly the words he had used while scolding the ambassador earlier. "When I first came to Earth," Ambassador Shaq continued, "many businesses tried to impress me. They broke their own rules to accommodate me. They ignored their standards to please me." He set down his teacup carefully. "But not StarDrive Motors. This company had principles." Ms. Kim and Secretary Park exchanged surprised looks. Mr. Lee stopped fidgeting with his tie. "And today," the ambassador said, "you prove that those principles still exist. When you saw someone breaking the rules, even someone much larger than you, even someone you might have guessed was important, you've stood firm." "But sir," Mr. Han protested, "I was rude. I tried to force you to leave." Ambassador Shaq laughed, the sound making the teacups rattle. "Force me? Mr. Han, I'm 3 times your size. You didn't try to force me. You stood on principle. There's a difference." The alien reached into his diplomatic robes and pulled out a small device. This time, Mr. Han didn't try to stop him from activating it. A holographic display appeared above the table, showing StarDrive Motors' corporate structure. "Your dedication to standards is exactly what we need more of," Ambassador Shaq said. which is why I'm promoting you to Global Quality Control Director." Mr. Han's mouth fell open. Mr. Lee spilled his tea. Ms. Kim gasped, and Secretary Park nearly fell off his chair. But, Mr. Han struggled to find words. "I tried to kick you out of the showroom." "Yes." Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled with delight. "You did. While everyone else was bowing and scraping, you treated me like any other customer who didn't follow the rules. Do you know how refreshing that is?" The alien stood up, his head nearly touching the ceiling. "In my culture, we believe that true character shows itself when someone thinks they have nothing to gain. You didn't know what it was, but you still maintained your standards. That's the kind of integrity we need overseeing all our dealerships." Mr. Lee finally found his voice. "But sir, what about the regional director position? I thought—" "Oh, you'll still be regional director, Mr. Lee," Ambassador Shaq assured him. "But Mr. Han will be your new boss. Perhaps he can teach you when it's appropriate to bow and when it's better to stand firm." The afternoon sun had moved lower in the sky, casting golden light through the quantum glass windows. Mr. Han sat very still, trying to process what was happening. This morning, he had been a dealership manager enforcing showroom protocol. Now he was being offered responsibility for quality control across StarDrive's global operations. "There is one condition," Ambassador Shaq added, his expression becoming serious. "Yes, sir?" Mr. Han asked quietly. "You must promise to maintain your standards. No matter who walks into any of our dealerships, human, Centaurian, or even the Emperor of Mars." The alien's eyes twinkled at using Mr. Han's own words. "The rules must apply equally to everyone." Mr. Han straightened in his chair. This, at least, was something he understood perfectly. "Ambassador, I give you my word. Our standards will never be compromised." "Excellent." Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled with approval. "Now about that models I was examining earlier." "Of course, sir. But first," Mr. Han stood up and smoothed his tie. "We'll need to complete the proper paperwork. Even for the owner, there are procedures to follow." The ambassador's laughter echoed through the dealership once again. But this time, Mr. Han allowed himself to smile. Perhaps some mistakes weren't really mistakes after all. 1 week had passed since the incident at StarDrive Motors. Mr. Han sat in his new office on the 50th floor of StarDrive Tower in downtown Seoul. The view of the city stretched out before him, hovercars moving in perfect lines between the skyscrapers. Ms. Kim had been promoted to his personal assistant, and she entered the office carrying a large datapad. "Sir, the global quality reports are ready for your review." Mr. Han nodded, turning away from the window. His new office was much larger than his old one at the dealership, but he had arranged everything with the same careful precision. Every item on his desk sat at exactly the right angle. "How many dealerships have reported so far?" he asked. "All 2,000 worldwide, sir," Ms. Kim replied. Ambassador Shaq was very clear that every location must submit daily reports to you now. Mr. Han studied the first report on the datapad. A dealership in New York had allowed a customer to test drive a vehicle without completing the proper documentation first. He made a note to address this immediately. A gentle chime announced another visitor. Secretary Park, who had also been promoted to the corporate office, stepped in nervously. "Sir, Ambassador Shaq is here for the scheduled inspection." The massive Centaurian ducked through the doorway, his scales catching the morning light. He wore formal diplomatic robes, but moved with the same casual confidence that had so irritated Mr. Han that first day in the showroom. "Mr. Han," the ambassador greeted him warmly. "I trust you're settling into your new position." "Yes, Ambassador." Mr. Han stood and bowed slightly. "I've already identified several areas where our global standards need improvement." Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled with interest. "Show me." Mr. Han activated the large display screen on his office wall. Graphs and charts appeared, showing quality metrics from StarDrive dealerships around the world. Each chart was color-coded and precisely aligned. As you can see, Mr. Han explained, pointing to one particular graph, our European dealerships have been allowing too much variance in vehicle positioning. Some display models are being shown at 43 degrees instead of the required 45. Ms. Kim and Secretary Park exchanged glances. It seemed their boss hadn't changed at all, despite his promotion. And here, Mr. Han continued, bringing up another chart. Our Australian locations have reported increased quantum blast smudges. I've already implemented a new cleaning protocol. Ambassador Shaq moved closer to the display, his yellow eyes scanning the data. Most impressive. You've accomplished all this in just 1 week. Of course, Mr. Han replied. Standards cannot wait. The alien's laughter filled the office. You know, my fellow investors thought I was making a mistake promoting you so quickly. They said your incident with me should have resulted in immediate dismissal. Mr. Han stiffened slightly, but maintained his professional demeanor. Their concern was understandable, Ambassador. But I told them something important about humans, Ambassador Shaq continued. I said that your species' greatest strength isn't your technology, or your adaptability, or even your creativity. He turned to face Mr. Han directly. It's your ability to stand firm for what you believe is right, even in the face of seemingly overwhelming opposition. Secretary Park shifted uncomfortably. He still had nightmares about watching his boss confront the 8-foot-tall alien in the showroom. Ambassador, Mr. Han said carefully, about that day. I still feel I should apologize for my behavior. No. Ambassador Shaq's voice was firm. Never apologize for maintaining standards. Do you know why I really came to your dealership that day? Everyone in the office looked at him curiously. Our analysts had identified StarDrive Motors as the best-performing hover car company on Earth. But I needed to know why. The alien's scales shifted to a deeper blue as he spoke. Was it just good marketing? Clever financial management? Or was there something more fundamental? He walked to the window, looking out at the city below. When you confronted me, when you dared to enforce your standards even against someone 3 times your size, I had my answer. This company's success comes from people like you, Mr. Han. People who believe that doing things right matters more than doing things easily. Ms. Kim noticed that Mr. Han's expression had changed slightly. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked truly proud, not just satisfied with maintaining order. Which is why, Ambassador Shaq continued, turning back to face them, I've decided to implement your standards across all our dealerships in the Centaurian Alliance as well. Mr. Han's eyes widened. The Centaurian Alliance. But that's hundreds of worlds. 412, to be precise. The ambassador's scales rippled with amusement. I hope you're ready for some off-world travel. Those dealerships won't inspect themselves. Secretary Park nearly dropped his datapad. Ms. Kim gasped softly, but Mr. Han simply straightened his tie, a gesture that had become legendary throughout StarDrive Motors. I'll need to create proper inspection protocols for different gravitational environments, he said thoughtfully, and we'll have to account for various atmospheric conditions affecting the quantum blasts. Ambassador Shaq's laughter once again filled the office. You see, this is exactly why I chose you. Most humans would be overwhelmed by the scope of the task. You immediately focus on maintaining standards. Mr. Han allowed himself a small smile. Standards are standards, Ambassador, whether on Earth or across the galaxy. The morning sun continued to rise over Seoul, its light reflecting off the endless stream of hovercars below. In his perfectly organized office, Mr. Han began making notes about interstellar quality control procedures. He had gone from managing a single dealership to overseeing standards across hundreds of worlds, all because he had refused to compromise his principles. As Ambassador Shaq prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Oh, and Mr. Han, one more thing. Yes, Ambassador. That Modelux in your old showroom. I'll take it. But the alien's eyes twinkled. I insist on following all the proper procedures first. 3 months after his promotion, Mr. Hand stood on the observation deck of a Centaurian space station. Earth shone like a blue jewel in the distance. He adjusted his tie, a habit that had now become famous across two civilizations. The quantum glass on these windows needs cleaning, he noted, making a mark on his datapad. Ms. Kim, who had adapted remarkably well to space travel, nodded in agreement. I'll add it to the maintenance reports, sir. They were preparing for the grand opening of Star Drive Motors' first orbital showroom. The massive space station housed hundreds of hover cars, each positioned at exactly 45 degrees, even in zero gravity. The anti-gravity stabilizers are properly calibrated, Mr. Han asked. Yes, sir, Secretary Park replied from his new floating desk. All vehicles maintain perfect position, regardless of gravitational fluctuations. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, and Ambassador Shaq entered. His scales had taken on a silvery sheen in the starlight, matching the metallic walls of the space station. Mr. Han, the ambassador called out cheerfully, I see you're ensuring everything meets our standards. Of course, Ambassador. Mr. Han bowed slightly, maintaining perfect balance in the low gravity. Though I must note that the station's quantum blast cleaning protocols need improvement. Ambassador Shaq's laughter echoed through the station, causing several nearby hover cars to vibrate slightly. Their anti-gravity stabilizers adjusted automatically, maintaining their precise angles. You know, the ambassador said, moving to stand beside Mr. Han at the window, in the past 3 months, our customer satisfaction ratings have increased by 40% across all worlds. Mr. Han nodded. Maintaining consistent standards produces consistent results. Indeed, Ambassador Shaq's scales rippled with pride. The Centaurian High Council was skeptical when I suggested implementing Earth-style customer service protocols. They thought our ways were superior. And now, Ms. Kim asked, curious. Now, the ambassador gestured to the massive showroom behind them. Now they want to know why we didn't do this sooner. Your attention to detail, your dedication to procedure. These things transcend species, Mr. Han. Secretary Park brought up a holographic display showing the latest sales figures. Every graph pointed upward, each line as straight and precise as the vehicles in their showrooms. We've received inquiries from the Proximan Federation, Park reported. They want to open Star Drive dealerships in their system as well. Mr. Han straightened his jacket. They will need to follow our standards precisely. No exceptions. Would you like to tell them that personally? Ambassador Shaq asked, his yellow eyes twinkling. Their representatives are waiting in the conference room. Mr. Han looked surprised for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. Are they prepared to complete the proper documentation? They brought their own datapads, Ms. Kim said with a smile. Your reputation precedes you, sir. The group made their way through the showroom, passing rows of perfectly positioned hover cars. Each vehicle gleamed under the starlight, their quantum glass windows spotless, their positions exact. In the conference room, 3 Proximan representatives waited. They were tall, crystalline beings whose bodies seemed to shimmer with internal light. All 3 stood perfectly straight. Their datapads held at precisely the correct angle for formal business meetings. Welcome to Star Drive Motors, Mr. Han said, bowing precisely 45 degrees. I understand you wish to discuss implementing our standards in your federation. The Proximans bowed in return, matching his angle exactly. We have studied your protocols extensively, the lead representative said, their voice chiming like crystal. We are particularly impressed with your insistence on maintaining 45-degree display angles. Mr. Han allowed himself a small smile. Then you understand that there can be no deviation from these standards, even for cultural differences. We would expect nothing less, the Proximan replied. In fact, we have already begun training our staff in proper quantum glass cleaning techniques. Ambassador Shaq watched with obvious pleasure as Mr. Han began his standard presentation on Star Drive Motors' quality control protocols. The former dealership manager moved through each point methodically, his voice confident, his posture perfect. Ms. Kim leaned close to Secretary Park and whispered, "Remember when he used to do this presentation just for our small showroom in Seoul?" Park nodded. "Now he's teaching it to beings from across the galaxy, and they're taking notes." Indeed, the Proximan representatives were recording every word, their crystalline forms vibrating with attention. When Mr. Han explained the importance of proper documentation, they actually applauded. As the presentation concluded, Ambassador Shaq stepped forward. "There's one more thing you should know about Mr. Han," he told the Proximans. 3 months ago, he tried to throw me out of his showroom for touching the quantum blast without permission." The crystalline beings looked shocked. One of them actually turned slightly pink with surprise. It was that dedication to standards, regardless of who was violating them, that earned him his current position. The ambassador continued. "So if you truly wish to join the StarDrive family, remember this. Our rules apply to everyone, from the smallest customer to the highest diplomatic official." Mr. Han felt his face grow warm, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Thank you, Ambassador. Now shall we proceed with the preliminary paperwork?" The Proximans eagerly activated their datapads. As Mr. Han began guiding them through the proper forms, he caught a glimpse of Earth through the window. From up here, his old showroom in Seoul was just one tiny point on that blue sphere. But its standards, his standards, were now spreading across the stars. Ambassador Shaq moved to stand beside him again. "You know, Mr. Han, some beings might let this kind of success change them. They might become more flexible with the rules, more willing to compromise." "Never," Mr. Han replied firmly, straightening his tie one more time. "Standards are standards, Ambassador, in Seoul or in space." The massive alien scales rippled with satisfaction. "And that, my friend, is why I knew I was right about you. Now about that quantum blast cleaning protocol you mentioned earlier." Mr. Han's eyes lit up as he pulled out his datapad. In the background, Earth continued its eternal dance among the stars, while in a space station far above it, a former dealership manager taught the galaxy about the importance of doing things right. And somewhere in Seoul, a perfectly clean model's hover car sat in Ambassador Shaq's personal garage, positioned at exactly 45 degrees, just as Mr. Han would have wanted it.